And we start with the first speaker, who is absolutely one of the most inspiring narrative designers I have had privilege to know in person as well. And I really warmly welcome Eevi Korhonen from Housemarque to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Natasha. It's great to be here again. It's great to be talking about Returnal. Some of you might have seen a version of this talk, and I realized I'm giving the same talk. I've given the same talk multiple times, but it's never quite the same. So kind of like the joke is that similar to Returnal, there is no canonical version of this talk. You will be able to debate which one is the truest, but there isn't one. But yeah. Today, let's talk about structure a little bit. So some introductions. I'm going to talk you how Returnal came to be as a game. And then I'm going to talk about little high-level narrative philosophy we had. Then some narrative techniques and conclusions and lessons. And if you have any questions, please save them to the end if we have time for them. And of course, huge spoiler alert, because it's impossible to talk about Returnal story without spoiling huge parts of it. So first up, who am I? Hi, I'm Eevi. I'm the senior narrative designer at Housemarque. I've been in the industry for more than 10 years now, and I've worked in everything from mobile to that brief period when Facebook games were actually a thing. And then I've been mostly working in AAA over the last 5-7 years. And on the right, you can see some of the companies I've worked for, and my previous work before Returnal was another, maybe slightly known Finnish game called Control. But in case there's someone who hasn't seen Returnal or played it, let's watch the trailer briefly.
Astra, is anyone listening? It's Celine.
Can we do anything about the lights?
I've crashed on Atropos. Suit status operational, but my sidearm is missing. Heading towards White Shadow broadcast. I have found a deceased Astra Scout here. Checking identification on a helmet. It's... my sidearm. Continuing towards the signal's origin. That can't be here. Do you see the White Shadow?
Okay, we can switch back. Yeah, so as you may have been able to spot from the trailer, in terms of gameplay, Returnal is a third-person shooter. More precisely, it's a fast-paced, bullet hellish action game with a roguelike structure. And in terms of story genres, we combine hard sci-fi with some psychological thriller and cosmic horror thrown in for a good mix. And in the game, you play as Celine, the scout who crash lands on an alien planet called Atropos. And she's been drawn in by this mysterious signal that contains the phrase, "Do you see the White Shadow?" She soon finds herself trapped on this planet, and even death provides no escape, as every time she dies, she returns back to the crash site. and she must fight her way through these hostile environments filled with horrible tentacled enemies and trace the signal's origin and use it to send an SOS signal if she is to have any hope of truly escaping. And this is just the setup to the full story, which is much deeper and much weirder. But before we talk more about that, we need to talk about the game's origins. Returnal was very much a product of the kind of ambitions and constraints we had for it, so I'd like to take a moment to shed a light on them. So, to do that, introducing Housemarque. Founded over 27 years ago, 28 now, it is the oldest still existing game company in Finland. We beat Remedy by a couple of months. We never lorded over them. And it is mostly known for these arcade-inspired games with twin-stick shooter mechanics, lots of bullet hell, most famous Super Stardust HD and Resogun. And we're also very known for this kind of like very bright, particle-heavy VFX style. So this is a screenshot from Nex Machina, the game we made before Returnal. And we went from this to this. So that wasn't without its challenges. As you can tell from those screenshots, this was our first foray into what we call AAA space. And we did it with a new engine, in a new genre, and for a new platform. So there was a lot of learning involved, and this, of course, cut the time we actually had to develop the game itself. We also had a very small team to pull this off with. Core team was roughly 75 people with roughly the same amount of external developers. And a special shout out to the creative arts people at Sony who did the amazing job, the 2 BAFTA-winning audio and music coming very much from their hands. And then out of those 75 people, maximum 4 people at any one time were part of the narrative team. And that also was something completely new for Housemarque. We've never had a narrative team within kind of like Housemarque production line. So that also meant that there were no existing pipelines or processes on how to incorporate narrative. And we had to build those while creating all the narrative content. And then there was this small thing happened. I don't know about it much. So while the challenges were pretty formidable, so was our ambition. So from our creative director, Harry Kruger, we got 2 main creative goals. The first one was to haunt the player. And this meant we wanted to leave the player thinking about the game long after the credits had rolled. He wanted there to be some mystery to the events and whether any of the events in the game were actually real or not. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then our second goal was to tell a deep, dark, and mature story. And given that our gameplay was still going to be very true to Housemarque's roots, this was probably our biggest challenge. How to marry that fast-paced, bright action with bullets and lasers and explosions with a story that was almost the exact opposite of that, a slowly building dark mystery about a middle-aged woman and her trauma. And the themes are pretty heavy: guilt, generational trauma, the clashing of motherhood with career ambitions. And because this is partly a cosmic horror game, the mental health of the central character is also suspect. So, based on those challenges and ambitions, we arrived at our narrative philosophy. We had a chance to define the storytelling direction, not just for Returnal, but for the next era of Housemarque games, and perhaps even inspire other games. And we wanted to be bold and ambitious. We wanted to be doing things that hadn't been done or seen in AAA space before, or at least not much. So, let's talk about that narrative philosophy, the pillars upon which we built Returnal. First of all, we wanted to keep gameplay at the center of the experience. We knew this was going to be an evolution, not a revolution of Housemarque games, and that meant that the action would always be at the center stage. We made a conscious decision that at the very start that the critical path through the game would be as lean and mean as possible. We wanted to avoid these stop and read or stop and listen moments that would interrupt that flow and take the player out of it. Instead, we worked hard to tell the story through the production design, audio design, and of course, narrative design. Everything from items to enemies to even the mechanic of scanning were suffused with the story, so the player would get little passive doses of the story, even if they weren't engaging with the story content itself. And this led actually most of the proper story content to being fully optional. The player gets to choose when or even if they want to engage with that. But we worked hard to make that content enticing enough so the players would take time to explore it. And then, now that's working. Yeah, we also adopted a less is more attitude towards our narrative. Because our narrative team was so small, we wanted to work smart, not hard. And we wanted to keep the number of big intensive features, such as cinematics, to a minimum. And this also resulted there being no interactable NPCs in the game. We did entertain this idea early on in the production, but we ultimately decided to cut them. And this was good for scope, but also helped keep the narrative as a rare treat for the player, a breather from the action instead of an obstacle between the player and the action. And finally, we embraced mystery and ambiguity to serve that goal of haunting the player. We set up quite a traditional mystery at the beginning of the game. Why is Celine trapped in the loop? And what is this mysterious signal? But these become quickly overshadowed by the bigger mystery. Are any of the events on this planet even real? And we wanted to support multiple theories of what really happened. The three main ones being, this is all real, this is all happening in Celine's head, or this is Celine's personal hell. And this worked to the point that even within the narrative team, we had kind of opposing opinions on what was real or what was not. So, storytelling in a roguelike game, that's also challenging. It meant that player would be dying over and over again, losing all non-permanent progress every time they did that. And it meant that they would experience that first biome probably hundreds of times, but the last one maybe only tens. The levels would also be rearranged every time the player died, and these factors, combined with our decision to make the majority of the story content optional, meant that we had much less control over the pacing of the story than in a traditional linear game. But we decided to lean into that structure by intentionally repeating, remixing, and most importantly, recontextualizing the content. Things that seem meaningless in the beginning start to gain meaning just from repetition. And I think the best example of this is the mysterious astronaut that you might have spotted in the trailer. It truly exemplifies our goal of haunting the player. It shows up in Celine's past, it shows up on the planet, and it even shows up on the alien writings and holograms. It's not an enemy, but its presence is ominous because the player doesn't quite know what they want or why is it there. And we never outright answer those questions. But the deeper the player goes into the story content, they start to associate it with certain things, and that gives it meaning. So we can start showing these things very early on to the player, but withhold the context until later, creating a mystery, a question that the player wants to answer. And because mystery is the name of the game, a reference to those of you who know, we can start the player with minimal information and loop them in gradually. You are Celine, you're an astronaut, you've crash landed on this planet, and you're searching for this mysterious signal. That's all you need to know, and all you get to know actually, before you're placed in her shoes. You learn more about her as you keep exploring and fighting and dying your way through this planet. But because of this, we could afford to scatter the various pieces that make up the story all over the planet and trust that through the repeated playthroughs, the player who is interested in the story will find all of them eventually. And finally, we embrace the horror and or the fun of the loop, depending on your viewpoint. The loop is also part of the narrative reality. Celine is aware of the loop and remembers at least some of her previous past experiences on the planet, and that makes it a pretty delicious piece of cosmic horror. And because we center gameplay, we wanted this game to be always playable, even after the player had run out of bespoke and narrative content. So no matter what happens, Celine still has to be stuck on the planet, or in her mind, or in hell, depending on your interpretation. And we wanted the story to acknowledge that. So Celine will always be stuck in the loop. So we talked a little bit about the mystery, but how do we actually build on it? You make a story onion, if you can see it. Can we kill the lights a little bit more so we can see it better? Anyway, we make a story onion with separate layers that the player then can peel back. And it has three main layers: the loop, the planet, and the hero. And out of these, the most important thing to us was the hero. She's the core of the story, and everything needs to flow outwards from her. So we figured out her life story first, a version of some events that led her to arrive on this planet with all her trauma. And then we built outwards from there. Celine's personal journey informs the planet layer, the extinct alien civilization, and what happened to it. And then the cosmic loop itself to some extent. In reality, of course, game development is messy. It never happens this neatly, but it applies in terms of what we prioritized when we went editing the story. And then the player experiences this in the opposite order, discovering the obscured story by digging inwards. The most obvious experience is the loop, because that's almost the same as the gameplay loop. You live, you die, you repeat. And it's also the layer with the lightest amount of story content. And then you start to explore the planet, and you notice all this alien technology and ruins. And then you maybe start to wonder, what happened to this clearly powerful and technologically advanced civilization? And then you start picking up audio logs, and you run into the house, and you start to realize that a lot of the things on this planet are very personal to Celine. But we'll talk more about that later. And actually, when you think about it, these layers neatly correspond to the plot, the setting, and the themes. And they match our genres really well. The loop is about cosmic horror. You are unable to die. And you're trapped in this kind of horrible nightmare of a planet. And then the planet itself, with its aliens, that's very science fiction. And then at the kind of core of it is the psychological thriller, Celine's own personal trauma and how it's manifesting there. And all of it's tied together with a hefty dose of Greek mythology. And note that even though I'm presenting the layers neatly like this, it's not really like it in the game. We just mix it and blur the lines, and it all becomes kind of like one beautiful mess. And talking about blurring, once we had the initial version of Celine's story figured out, we started muddying the waters intentionally by adding confusing and even contradictory elements to the story, so that all those different theories about what was happening could find purchase in the right minds. And I'm going to run you through some methods with quick examples. First, timeless feel. We wanted to keep the timeline vague, both on textual and visual level. We avoid mentioning any years or dates whenever possible, which create this both timeless and a little unreal feel to things. And on a visual level, our UI and art team took inspiration from retrofuturism when designing the menus, screens, and devices that are in Celine's ship and suit, so that our technology wouldn't allow the player to date us either. And then characters. There are other human characters in the story, even though we very rarely see them. Since this is a story about generational trauma, both Celine's mother, Thea, and her child, Helios, play an important role. But they're almost never talked about or represented in the game in clear terms. They almost feel like characters in ancient myths. And because Greek mythology is the basis for all our naming, this creates an additional layer of meaning to these characters. And we sometimes, we created additional confusion with this, since in Greek myth, Helios is actually Celine's brother. Then there's paradoxes and parallel events in our story. Or you could think of them even as cyclical events, same events and motifs that keep repeating. The most important of these is the ship crashing on the planet at the start of the game, which is paralleled by car crash in Celine's past. And this is a pivotal event in her backstory and major source of her trauma. And it is implied that she caused both of these events through time paradoxes. We also play a lot with metaphors and symbolism, the biggest one referring to our characters. Helios, her son and or brother, is also the name of her crashed ship. And Celine is the moon goddess in Greek myth, and the moon of Atropos is shown either whole or broken in different parts of the story. And finally, we undermine each and every narrator in the game. Whatever event, text, audio log, hologram you come across, there is a reason to doubt its veracity. We'll talk more about those in the narrative techniques section, but before we get there, there's one more thing, and that is our act structure. Returnal actually has a 3-act structure, but it's a little unusual. Let me explain. So, we have our Act 1, and That's the first half of the game, all the way up until you get to the signal. And it's mostly very much in the realm of grounded sci-fi. We start off the game with a straightforward predicament and hold off on more of the mysterious elements until later. So, as I said, this act culminates in Celine reaching the signal's origin, using it to signal her mothership, and getting rescued. She returns to Earth, lives out her life happily, and dies of old age. And as our creative director, Harry, said, we have a happy ending, but it's in the middle of the game. And then comes our delicious midpoint twist. Act 2 begins with Celine waking up on the planet back at the crash sites she left behind decades ago. And I think this is a perfect marriage of our roguelite structure and our narrative. No matter where or when you die, you will always return back here. But this time the planet has changed. Now it is clear that she can't escape this way just by escaping the planet. So she must find the source of the loop that keeps her here. So in Act 2, we play more overtly into the psychological thriller genre. References to Celine's past are more overtly present in the world, and whether this spiraling into madness is internally or externally influenced, it is intensifying. And in the end, she finally descends into the center of the planet and encounters a cosmic entity. And in the final cutscene, the source of her guilt is revealed. The car crash where a mother and son were plunged into a lake in an attempt to avoid an astronaut on the road. And whether anyone actually survived that crash remains somewhat an open question. And then begins Act 3. Celine is still not free of the cycle because there is one more mystery to figure out. Who is the astronaut? Was it really there to cause the crash in the first place? Or was it just some sort of hallucination? And to reach the answer to this question and to reach the secret ending, the player can now freely travel between Act 1 and Act 2 environments. So not only are they almost different timelines, we treat them almost as separate places. And Act 3 remains this end state of the game, because as I mentioned earlier, the loop cannot be broken or the game would truly end. So, now I want to show you how we actually told that story to our players, or at least part of it, because this slot is not 3 hours long, so I had to pick my top 3 for this one. And let's begin with the meatiest part of the story, the house sequences. They are short, first-person exploratory sequences taking place in the titular house. There are a total 6 of them in the game, and they unlock as the player progresses in the game. And these sequences are fully optional, but access point to them, the house, is placed on the main path of the first biome. So the player will always be running into it or past it. And up to this point in the game, everything on the planet has been very traditional sci-fi fare. Tentacle monsters, alien ruins, holograms, and the like. And then bang. Here is your average 20th century house, just chilling. And already that juxtaposition sets it apart from all the other mysterious things on the planet. But we go a little further in teasing the player's curiosity by not allowing them to enter it when they first see it. So they first have to find a key in the same biome before they can go in. And from there on, the house will always have these warm and inviting lights on whenever it is accessible and there is a new house sequence for the player. And then when there isn't, the house looks dark and dilapidated. And when you do enter the house, we do this switch from third-person camera to first-person camera. Yes, we put a walking sim in a bullet hell game. And it has actually a purpose. It puts the player in a different mindset, going from this fast-paced action into a slower, more thoughtful exploration mode. These house sequences also introduce new kinds of interactions, like picking up books and reading them, or even on one occasion, a dialogue wheel. So this mode switch prevents the player from ruining the mood by jumping on things or shooting at things, so we can maintain this more mysterious and a little disquieting atmosphere in the house. And then, the house sequences are implied to be Celine's memories, but because of the timeless nature of the house, it's unsure when these are actually taking place, or are you even experiencing them in an order, chronological order. But memories are also notoriously unreliable things, and we don't help things by undermining their reliability in multiple ways. One of these is an audio log found just outside the house that has Celine saying that she feels like she is reliving her memories in the house, but that some of them seem manufactured. There are also some discoveries in the house that undermine her as a narrator directly, such as a rejection letter from Astra, the company who sent her on this mission. And then there's the fact that you enter the house through the door, but you almost never exit it through that door. Almost always the house sequence ends in Celine passing out and waking up outside it, now dilapidated version of it, making the whole experience feeling more like a dream or a nightmare. So, switching gears from Celine to the more alien perspective for a while. Atropos is or was a home to a near-extinct alien civilization whose fate Celine can piece together from the writings and holograms they left behind. These writings are called xenoglyphs, as a nod to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And they're meant to be almost as hard to decipher. You can almost see it in this light. And throughout Atropos, Celine can find these stone pillars with writing on them and begin to translate them by collecting xenoglyph ciphers. Each text has 3 tiers to unlock, and we always made sure that the first tier would be easy to get, but that last one always required a bit more playtime and exploration. This to ensure that the player will have time to experience a bit of the mystery and anticipation before the full translation is revealed. Although full translation being a bit of a kind of like a misnomer here, because I believe that translation is inherently interpretive and subjective. And as a former translation student, this is my pet peeve in video games. The gamified translation mechanics where you gather little language tokens which allow you to take a text in a dead language and turn it into fully understandable English. I hate it. I hate it so much. That is not how translation works at all. The interpreter's own context, the time they live in, the culture they live in, the technology that they use affects the translation and its accuracy. And in our case, the translation is from an alien language. This is an alien civilization. They would have words for concepts we can't even begin to understand. So we decided to go a little bit a different route. The translations are very subjective. We incorporated words and phrases that were very personal and meaningful to Celine. It almost feels like the writer or the translating computer is picking up these words directly from her head. And that feels a little uncomfortable, doesn't it? Oh, I've done some things to these slides. Yes. So, the text the player sees are framed as translations, but we make the player question their accuracy, not just because of the deeply personal meanings, but by stating it directly in the UI itself. Let's take a look. If the slides cooperate. All right. This is most likely the first xenoglyph that you will encounter in the game. The part that we worked on the most was how to signal different levels of certainty in this text. So let me walk you through that. This is first tier out of the 3 that I mentioned. You don't need to actually see the text properly, but you can hopefully see that there's 3 formatting styles in there. We start off first with this kind of like teal-colored jumble of symbols. This indicates the source text, or the parts of the text that the computer is unable to decipher at the moment, fully untranslated. Then we have the bolded yellow text in all caps to indicate fully translated text, our severed brethren. These parts needed to stand out most to the player, so the player could at glance see the most salient parts of the text, which we then used as hooks to get the player interested in translating the rest of it. We often left a lot of like interesting gaps intentionally, like stop the endless cycle of what? An endless cycle sounds very, very familiar to Celine though, doesn't it? And then finally, we have this little bit of text, also in yellow, but unbolded and in small caps. Agitated waters, question mark? This was the hardest, but the most interesting layer to craft. These were the personal meanings I was talking about earlier. And each of these, what we called mistranslations, would be completely unrelated to the final translation. So initially, the player might think that these are just some kind of hiccups of the computer, but actually later, they turn out to be very, very different from that initial thought. Then here's tier 2 of that same text. You'll notice the amount of fully translated or certain text has increased, and we have very little left of that untranslated text. But we have more of those mistranslations here now. We have octopus upstairs and seizures. The text is still tantalizingly unfinished to entice the player to return for that final layer of the text. But that reference to the octopus upstairs, that's actually something the player will encounter in House Sequence 2 that will still likely be ahead of them in their playthrough. So what felt initially just a random concept becomes almost scary foresight. And the reference to seizures is an example of medical terminology that we also liberally sprinkled throughout the text. And they can be taken as a reference to the physical trauma that Celine experienced as part of her car crash, but they also seep in at such high frequency that the player could begin to think that Celine's mind is filtering this all medical jargon in because she's still in a hospital, stuck in a coma, perhaps. And here we see the final tier, which has the full message in it. But if you can see at the top, the translation accuracy still stands at 78%. But it's also translation complete. You can't do anything more. And I know this probably drove several players up the wall, but this was very much intentional. This is the undermining that we do, the sowing of the uncertainty, that the player never feels like they're getting the full picture, that ideal of fully accurate translation. And we play with this number more in Act 2, actually having the percentage go down as you translate. And in Act 3, there is no number, there is just error messages. And we also do something interesting with the narrator voice inside the xenoglyphs, but that is a whole other story I had to cut for time. And then finally, we have the ship log, which is only accessible inside the crash ship at the start of every run. So, more computer stuff, but this one has a different twist. The conceit here is that the computer has become damaged in the crash, and the files are fragmented, and it will take some time to defragment them. So only a few files are available to you at the start of the game, and more of them unlock as the player progresses in the game, giving you something to look forward to as you return to the crash site with yet another unfortunate death. And then the twist is that we show the player a different version of that file based on which act they're in. So remember when I said that in Act 3 you can actually travel freely between the Act 1 and Act 2 environments? So technically all of this information is accessible, but never in the same timeline. Oopsie. So this was kind of crucial for setting up these acts as two timelines, two realities perhaps even, and not placing one above the other. And it's important because the contradictions in these texts are pretty major. And what's the content here? It begins quite normally, giving us a little glimpses of Celine through her employer's lens, messages from her superiors, from her co-workers, her personnel file. But like many things, the further you go, the more we leave that comfortable, understandable realm of sci-fi, and the more your brain starts to boil like the frog in that metaphor. And I have two examples of this for you. So first, this is Celine's personnel file. This is Act 1 on the left and Act 2 on the right. You don't need to be able to read the details because hopefully you can get the gist of it. The Act 2 file says, no such employee found. Giving a lot of credence to that theory that she never made it to Atropos or even space at all. And then, in later logs, we forsake all pretense of that these are regular messages, or at least that they're messages from regular senders. As I mentioned earlier, Greek mythology is the secret sauce that connects all these layers together, and this is the feature where we really go all in on it. The latter half of the logs are mostly various retellings or remixes of Greek myths. Again, don't worry if you can't read the text. But this log is about the destruction of the last Titan, and it also contains a snippet from the United States Declaration of Independence. You know, the one that ends in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then in Act 2, these texts become even darker versions of themselves. There's a certain theme to all the Act 2 logs. They are twisted, they're mean, they're almost custom designed to torment Celine. As if something on this planet or in her subconscious wants to break her down. So in Act 2, this log goes even darker and more obvious. The Act 1 begins, she lit the pyre. And this one in Act 2 begins, Selene lit the pyre. And the last Titan being burned is Helios. And this log also probably has my favorite piece of writing in the whole game by a wonderful writer, Luke Maulding. We hold these truths to be self-aware, that all men are uncreated, and that they are endowed by their redacted with certain unalienable, that among these are death, despair, and the pursuit of judgment. And while I would love to go through all of the game and point out every delicious detail, unfortunately, we don't have that time because time here is linear and non-renewable resource. So I must begin to conclude this presentation. So, conclusions, or a summary of what we went about, how we went about creating Returnal Story. Returnal Story came about from the creative constraints, great ambitions, and bold mixing of genres. It was truly a big first step into AAA space from a small team, and that shaped the story we told a lot. Before this, I wouldn't have believed that you could put a PT-style exploration scenes into a fast-paced bullet hell game, but that boldness paid off, and at least based on the awards that we got. And we built the story from Selene's journey outwards. Selene is the heart of the story, and while we first introduced the player to Cosmic Loop and the more grounded sci-fi, her journey into her past is truly what defines the story of Returnal, and it needed to reverberate to every other layer of our story onion. And we aimed to haunt the player. We slowly but surely blurred the reality. We used many methods to undermine the player's sense of reality, starting from the timeless and even little unreal atmosphere, all the way to incorporating Greek mythology into the game. And through them, the early mysteries of the signal and the loop are replaced by the ultimate mystery, is any of this even really happening? And lessons. This is not an earth-shattering revelation, but your story structure should fit your gameplay structure. Even if we went a little wild by adding creepy and atmospheric first-person sequences into this fast-paced third-person action game, the overall way we revealed our story fit the roguelike structure pretty well. We allowed the player to slowly put together these scattered puzzle pieces in their own time and rewarding the repeated playthroughs and progress by seeding in more and more of the mysterious and incongruent details. Our opening contains just the barest amount of exposition that you need to get the player going as fast as possible, but also sets up the mystery that invites the curious player to unravel it over multiple runs. And ambiguous storytelling can make less seem more. We made it our goal to avoid having one true version of the story, and that helped us to get most mileage out of the limited resources that we had. Our narrative minimalism, combined with the ambiguous storytelling, leaves space for multiple interpretations, which get debated and discussed online even today and probably for a long while after this. And lastly, we found that time loop stories are great for internal journeys. If you can't break the loop, the only way for the story to go somewhere is for the protagonist to realize something about themselves. The inner journey of discovery helps the player feel like they achieved something, that they got to know Selene and her past, despite there being no material change to the gameplay loop. And that's it. Also, we're hiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Eevi, so much. All right, so time for questions and comments, and for the Discord, because I realized I also left my phone here because it has been a lot going on, to be honest, behind the scenes. So, for those who are online, please do put in Q&A channel of the stage 1, and or you can even hear if you don't want to speak up as such. But yeah, the floor is open for questions, and I will come with the mic. So we have few. Let's start here.
I have 2 questions. One, is there any interpretations in the creation of the bosses of each biome? Do they fit the narrative in a way? Like, do they represent something?
So do the bosses represent something in the kind of story interpretation? Yes, they do have names from Greek mythology: Phrike, Ixion, Nemesis, Hyperion, and Ophion. So kind of like with the bosses, I recognized a lot of players wanted more out of them, but again, due to kind of like our concentrating more on Celine and some other aspects of the story, the bosses maybe were not as fleshed out and incorporated into the story as they could have been. But we kind of like worked hard to kind of like take the little that we could and imply things, especially with the names. So if you play through the fourth boss, Hyperion, and you look into the kind of Greek mythology, Hyperion and Thea were married, and Selene is one of the children of that marriage. Well, they were the father and mother of those children. I'm not sure if they technically were married, but yeah. So we there are things that if you look into the kind of myths that from which those names are derived, you can kind of like draw interesting conclusions.
And the second question, was there a scrap concept in which Celine becomes less and less human as more upgrades you gain? Because you keep getting this alien tech, and it seems that at some point it was going that direction, that you become more and more alien and probably end up being one of the aliens from the planet.
Yeah, so just to repeat so everyone can hear it, was there a scrap version where the more you have these alien upgrades, the progress items, you become less and less human and potentially even become one of the aliens? You might have seen Harry's talk, because I think he talks about this. So yes, that was one of the ideas. Okay, you should watch Harry's talk. Yeah, so that was one of the things that was left on the cutting room floor. The idea that when you kind of like have this alien tech that weirdly is compatible with your suit, that you become less and less human. There are audio logs where she talks about being irreversibly contaminated based on Astra's standards, because she has taken all these alien artifacts and just, slapped them on her suit. But kind of like, story-wise, that really doesn't pay off, but it was kind of like an interesting thought we were playing with. But unfortunately, it never came to fruition.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, fantastic talk. Really informative. And I just had a question about the reward for the player. Did you have any sort of signifier or reward for at least uncovering all the narrative content they could? Because I know you wanted to leave the story open and unending. But was there any sort of peace of mind given to some players who may have wanted at least some sort of resolution to know they uncovered the full story they could?
Well, you do achieve the platinum as you go about figuring out everything. Of course, the platinum has a tiny bit of problem that the ciphers are part of the platinum and they're randomly generated, and the players will never stop hating us for that, and definitely would not do that again. But yeah, so kind of like the thing that we set out to do was to provide no conclusive canonical version. And I actually looked a little bit into the psychology of closure, and there are just some people who, based on their habits and brain chemistry, just want closure. And some people are happier, like even if they don't get it. And we set out to make a non-conclusive story. And so a certain amount of players will always be unhappy with that we don't provide this is how it actually went, this is the true version. And I'm okay with that, because that was our goal and we achieved it, even if certain amount of players will never be happy with it. So yeah, I drink their tears every morning with my tea.
Cool, I'm one of them, thank you.
We have a question about, did art always follow story, or did story follow art at times?
Oh, the eternal question of game development. I think it was a two-way process. We got inspired by something that the artist did, and they got inspired by something we had written. So it's never fully like, I think, a one-way street in any game development project. Was there kind of like, I remember kind of like looking at the early concepts, and art team was really inspired by Geiger and Basinski, the Polish artist. Especially kind of like for the architecture, the kind of like weird stuff that was very kind of like brutalistic, but inside also kind of like very weird and creepy, and like lots of cables and weird things happening with them. And kind of like, of course, we were also inspired by cosmic horror, and both of those, well, Geiger maybe a little bit more body horror, but Basinski definitely was kind of like also an inspiration. Even kind of like his art doesn't, directly have any kind of like storytelling that we could, crib off. It was still kind of like very inspiring to look at these very tortured creatures and alien landscapes and imagine like, okay, how can we make the player feel like that? I think one of my favorite things where we kind of like, I think, like encapsulates that is an audio log where the player talks about like that when you peel back this alien architecture, you can kind of like almost find these like cables, like veins. And she talks about like, if I peel back my skin, will I find these same things? Which is very, very creepy.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. So lovely, and I really appreciated your micro rant on translating because I'm I'm right there with you. On that note, I was gonna ask if, because I guess in a similar timeline, Heaven's Vault was being made, and you were saying you hated translation in games. Do you have any feelings about Heaven's Vault?
Well, Heaven's Vault does it correctly.
Yes.
There it is about interpretation. So if anyone hasn't played Heaven's Vault, please play it. It's basically translation done correctly in a video game. You basically assign yourself the meaning to kind of like the words or the ideograms, logograms. So that to me is like how translation would work in the real world. You just have a piece of text and you're kind of hoping based on context that you are understanding it correctly. And kind of like what they do lovingly or correctly in that game is also that you sometimes get more pieces of context and then you realize that your previous translation was wrong and you can go back and correct that translation. So it's this back and forth and kind of like very interpretative way of approaching translation. So yeah, that is to me the way to do it. Kind of like I think what I think about when I think about the wrong way to do it is like Tomb Raider and like, oh, you found a piece of Russian, now your Russian skill is like 1 out of 5, and I'm like, I get an
The famously
you don't want me
easy to
see getting a
translate
stroke here.
language.
Thank you. We have another one here. Was there any significant inspiration for Celine outside of Greek mythology and lore?
Oh yes, very good question. I think we're kind of like initially. So let me give you some backstory. So when I was being interviewed for this project in summer 2018, we hadn't fully yet arrived at Celine. We just knew, or Harry knew at that time that kind of like he wanted the psychological baggage, trauma to kind of like come with the protagonist to the planet. And then at some point he also, because he just had kids as well, he kind of wanted this idea that there were kind of like, you know, some kind of tragic backstory involving, you know, a kid who kind of like lost their life as a kind of like tragic consequence of something that the parent did. And kind of like at that point, there hasn't been any kind of gender assigned to that character. I think they were kind of codenamed Alex or something, if I remember correctly, or the kid was Alex. But at that point, I decided in the interview that if I get hired, I'm going to make sure that this is not going to be a sad dad game. This is going to be a dark mother game. Yes. So like I was fully on board with kind of like Celine becoming Celine, and Harry got around to this like very easily, very quickly. And I think it added a lot more to the story, that it was also about this idea of like, what if you don't bond with your kid? What if you had the kid and you still kind of like want to have your career, but like the society is telling like you're a bad mother if you leave your kid at home. You should be somehow achieving both magically at the same time. And I think that was much more interesting to think about than kind of like, you know, if it was a dad. Like nobody thinks about a dad leaving the child at home and pursuing their career. There's no conflict there. But for a woman, that becomes immediately much more juicy and difficult to kind of like how to square that circle. So Celine kind of like initially had some kind of like her trait was driven to a fault. That was the kind of like core flaw, that whatever she kind of like wanted, she went for fully, even if that kind of like resulted in like tragedy for everyone all around. So kind of we looked at Ripley. I think she was kind of like a big inspiration, even though she was, I think, more action hero than Celine ended up being, because we wanted Celine not to be like a space marine. And one part of her that was very important to me was that she was more like a scout, a scientist. She comes to this planet and she scans things and she categorizes things, even though kind of like maybe through some little bit of suspension of disbelief and maybe muscle memory over multiple repeated deaths, she becomes quite adept at fighting. But it's not because she has experiences with it beforehand. It's more like something she does out of survival. So yeah, I think Ripley was the one that was the kind of like biggest like actual inspiration that I remember. But we just built her out of this desire to have like, what if middle-aged woman as an action hero?
I mean, yeah, we need more of those.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah. So, because we are running out of time and to respect also overall schedule as much as we can, all the other questions, first of all, Eevi is here throughout the day. Just keep talking. That's the whole point.
I will never be mad at you for asking me about Returnal. I love talking about Returnal. Come ask me about it.
And in Discord, do put the questions there so Eevi can also answer them there as well. She's as well in Discord. So, well, I want to thank you so much and also to give you a little gift, as every speaker will get, but also just something to remember this event with us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.